Your body remembers something your mind has forgotten. The tightness in the chest that arrives without warning, the startle reflex that other people find amusing and you find exhausting. The way you read a room in seconds, exits, moods, dangers, without deciding to. The relationships you keep repeating, the exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix. The sense that you are always slightly braced for something, even when nothing is coming. You didn't choose any of this, but your body learned it, and it has been loyal to that learning ever since. This is what happens when survival mode becomes your personality, and today we follow that story from the inside. Freud described trauma as a breach in the protective barrier against stimuli, not the event itself, the breach. Something enters that the organism cannot process. And what follows is not metaphorical damage, it is structural. The unity between body and mind fractures, and what was one thing becomes fragmented. The brain has a mechanism for this. The amygdala, functioning like a smoke detector inside the architecture of the mind, identifies danger and floods the body with adrenaline and cortisol in milliseconds. Heart rate accelerates, muscles prepare, the entire organism mobilizes to fight or to flee. But what happens when there is nowhere to run? What happens when the threat is the person who is supposed to protect you? The energy mobilized for survival has nowhere to go. It doesn't dissolve, it freezes, and the alarm, designed for temporary emergency, begins to ring permanently. The smoke never clears. The body starts to live in the past, reading harmless gestures as threats, responding to memory as if it were present danger, unable to rest because rest itself begins to feel like death. When neither fight nor flight is available, the nervous system makes a final choice. Freeze. The brain releases its own anesthetics and pain becomes numbness. And then something breaks that is harder to name. Imagine that the person holding the knife is the person who is supposed to hold you. There is no response the body can complete, so it leaves. The person begins to observe themselves from the outside, not as metaphor, but as a neurological event. The body stops being home and becomes a crime scene you are forced to live inside. And the body does not forget this, it converts. Chronic pain, fibromyalgia, autoimmune conditions. The emotional wound that could not be expressed outward turns inward and begins to reshape biology itself. The body speaks in the only language it has left. A child facing this learns quickly. The deepest pain available to a human being is the loss of attachment, the withdrawal of love, care, protection. And when the environment signals that authenticity costs attachment, the child makes a tragic calculation. Love has a price, your real face. Jung called this the persona, the mask, forged not in vanity but in agony. The child suppresses who she actually is, her rage, her grief, her need, and constructs an acceptable version. The mask works, she is accepted. The adult functions, but the mask is not free. What looks like success on the outside is frequently a slow drowning on the inside. The nervous system, strained by the effort of living as someone you are not, begins to fracture from within. The body starts speaking again. Fatigue, depression, the illnesses of a system that has been holding its breath for years. There is a part of you that would rather see you dead than let you feel. This is not a metaphor. It is the shadow, not simply as repression, not as a repository of inconvenient impulses, but as a demonic guardian. When the original pain is unbearable, when the threat is annihilation and not merely discomfort, the shadow emerges as an internal figure whose function is to sever the person's connection to reality, to anesthetize, to lock the innocent part of the self in a room and keep it there. The paradox is devastating. This guardian was built to protect, and it prefers chronic suffering to the risk of acute pain. It will choose depression, compulsion, panic, self-destruction, any form of managed misery, over the terrifying possibility of genuine feeling in the real world. You stay in the room forever. This is when survival mode becomes your personality. The victim and savior cycle is where this takes its social shape. Internally, the traumatized psyche divides a wounded, innocent part and a tyrannical protector who simultaneously promises rescue and demands submission. The child who is harmed doesn't only suffer, she frequently concludes that she is the cause, that if she were better, more obedient, more perfect, she could finally earn safety and love. This isn't irrationality, it is strategy. It preserves the illusion of control inside a situation of total powerlessness. At some point, the heroic self, the ego that managed everything, that kept the performance going, meets its limit. The archetype of the hero is the energy of adolescence, the drive to overcome, to be invulnerable. But the hero's destiny inevitably is death. Not physical death, the death of the illusion of invulnerability, the recognition that help is needed, that limits are real, that the armor was always hollow. What follows is the descent. If you are lucky, and lucky is not the wrong word, you will face it. It doesn't feel like transformation. It feels like dying. The ego is overwhelmed by what was buried. Jung experienced this personally and mapped it with terrifying precision. When the mystics called it the dark night of the soul, mythology encoded it as the descent into the underworld, the hero swallowed by the whale. These are not decorative metaphors. They are the names people gave to something real that they could not otherwise describe. James Hillman argued something that Western psychology has resisted for decades. Pathology is not a malfunction. Depression is not an error in the code. The pain, the suffering, a perspective warped by years spent in survival mode. These are, in Hillman's words, the ways the gods enter our lives and destroy the ego's control. To rush toward resurrection without allowing crucifixion is to misunderstand the entire structure of transformation. The greatest obstacle to this descent is the very system built to avoid it, the part of the psyche that encapsulated the innocent self and was designed not to feel. It will choose addiction, compulsion, chronic low-grade suffering, any alternative to the acute pain of encountering what was buried. Peter Levine's work with the body adds what no verbal framework can fully reach. The descent must be physical. Patients must voluntarily contact the terrifying sensations of paralysis, of immobility, of the body's frozen response, and stay. Not remember it, not talk about it, feel it. Levine called these mini-deaths, the still center of the terror, the eye of the hurricane. Only there, only at that precise location inside the body, does the immobility begin to dissolve. The vital energy, locked since the original wound, begins to move again. Not because you fixed it, because you finally stopped running from it. As Helen Luke wrote, the true suffering belongs to innocence, not to guilt. The shell cracks, and something that was waiting inside begins to breathe. When the pain is faced rather than fled, something shifts in its nature. The same anxiety that paralyzed becomes a guide. The same depression that buried becomes an invitation to depth. Jung described growth as happening not in protected environments, but through collision, conflict, grief, suffering, forged between the hammer and the anvil. The word remembering carries an etymology worth sitting with. Not only to recall, but to gather the scattered members of what was dismembered. Trauma breaks a person apart. What follows, patient, not compassionate, often agonizingly slow, is the gathering of those pieces into something that can hold together. Not a perfect body, a coherent one. The distinction that changes everything is between neurotic suffering and true suffering. Buddhism named what the defensive system produces the second arrow, the suffering we inflict on ourselves in trying to avoid the first wound. True suffering isn't more intense, it's more honest. When the frozen survival responses are renegotiated, When the body is finally allowed to complete what it could not complete then, the energy trapped inside the symptom is freed. The system shifts from fixation to flow. And what emerges is not a return to before. There is no before. There is only a person who traveled somewhere most people spend their entire lives avoiding, who knows the body from the inside, who carries an authenticity that cannot be performed because it was earned in places where performance was impossible. The trauma resolved, as one of the sources puts it, can be a gift of the gods. We began with a body that learned to treat the world as dangerous, a tightness in the chest, a vigilance with no name, a personality built in the dark, by a part of you that only wanted you to survive. We end here, not with a cure, not with a method, not with a promise that the descent is painless, only with a question worth sitting with, in silence for a moment. What you have been calling your personality, how much of it was chosen? Something is still alive in there, waiting. The books and primary sources that shape this video, Peter Levine, James Hillman, Donald Kalshed, Jung, and others, are in the description below. This video is part of the Psychology of Being Human playlist, because you cannot understand what you are without understanding what you survived. New videos twice a week, because at Tender Reason, we believe the body keeps the score, and it deserves to finally be heard.